The lives of cavemen, our Paleolithic ancestors who lived tens of thousands of years ago, were shaped by the slow rhythm of survival, necessity, curiosity, and connection to nature in its rawest form. And though we call them cavemen, not all of them lived in caves, but rather moved with the seasons and game, making use of caves when shelter was needed or when natural formations provided temporary safety from predators or weather. Their days were filled with the intense and constant pursuit of survival, yet within those routines were the seeds of human creativity, social bonding, and the beginnings of what we now recognize as culture. When a man or woman woke with the rising sun, the first thoughts were likely not philosophical or abstract, but rooted in the urgent question, how will I eat today? Their stomachs, often never truly full, dictated much of the daily agenda. A group might begin by sending out scouts, typically the young and swift males or experienced elders, to look for game trails, footprints, or signs of migrating herds. If luck was on their side and the terrain yielded bison, deer, or aurochs, then preparation would follow, spears sharpened with chipped flint, bows strung from gut or sinew, stone-tipped arrows bundled carefully, and the hunt would begin in silence, guided by gestures and sounds that wouldn't spook the prey. The hunting itself could take hours or days, requiring patience, coordination, and an intimate understanding of animal behavior, terrain, wind, and scent, and it was not uncommon for hunts to fail, leading to hunger, desperation, or the need to forage more widely. Meanwhile, others, often women, older members, and children, not idle at all, would spread out through forests, riversides, and hills to forage for edible roots, nuts, berries, eggs, tubers, and leaves, which demanded an encyclopedic knowledge of what was poisonous, what was seasonal, and what could be stored. They would also gather medicinal herbs, firewood, shells, and stone materials for tools. Children learned by watching, imitating, and playing, but play was a form of apprenticeship, as they carved small wooden spears or practiced flint knapping under the watchful eyes of their elders, while older children might already accompany adults on foraging trips or assist in butchering and cooking. Caves, when used, were not merely shelters but became symbolic centers of social life, storage, and sometimes spiritual expression. By the flickering firelight of the hearth, stories were told, not just to entertain, but to teach, warn, and remember. The elders, perhaps with white hair matted into cords or twisted into knots, would retell tales of hunts long past, of animal spirits, ancestors, or the stars above. Fire had an almost divine importance. It provided warmth, cooked meat to make it more digestible, and deterred predators, and its maintenance was often a group responsibility. Starting a fire from scratch, using friction or striking flint, was difficult, so glowing embers were carefully preserved, carried when moving camp, and guarded from rain. Around the fire, the group ate in silence or quiet talk, chewing sinewy meat or crushed nuts mixed with dried fruit. The night belonged to rest, to fear of unseen predators like saber-toothed cats or hyenas, and to the rituals of safety, watch shifts, reinforced cave entrances and prayers, or their Paleolithic equivalents to unseen forces. Though we lack written records, archaeological finds suggest that even early humans had spiritual lives. Burials were often deliberate and ritualized, with bodies placed in fetal positions, sprinkled with ochre, accompanied by tools, beads, or animal bones, which might indicate a belief in some form of afterlife or respect for the dead, perhaps shaped by grief, love, or awe at death's mystery. Art, too, played a role in their lives. The magnificent cave paintings in Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, dating back over 30,000 years, reveal that our ancestors weren't merely brutes surviving day to day, they were observers of beauty, memory, and symbolism. These images, painted with mineral pigments and animal fat, depict bison, horses, mammoths, and even abstract signs, not randomly or for decoration, but possibly as part of rituals, teachings, or magical beliefs intended to influence the hunt or honor animal spirits. Much of caveman life revolved around tools, which were as vital as food or fire. Flint was knapped into sharp blades, spearheads, or scrapers. Bones were carved into needles, fish hooks, or awls. Hides were softened and sewn into crude clothing, using sinew thread, and wood was shaped into clubs, handles, and digging sticks. The process of tool making was laborious, often passed down through demonstration and practice, and the most skilled toolmakers were valued members of their groups. Clothing, while basic, was vital, especially in colder climates. Stitched hides, fur-lined boots, and cloaks protected against frostbite and exposure, and shelters, whether caves, lean-tos, or mammoth bone huts, were reinforced with branches, hides, and stones. Weather dictated much of what they could do. In harsh winters, movement was limited, hunting more dangerous, and starvation a real threat. In spring and summer, the world burst with edible plants, migrating herds and opportunities to store food. But food storage was minimal. Without pottery or refrigeration, meat was smoked or dried, and excess food could attract predators or rot. So much of life remained hand-to-mouth, dictated by the next day's success. Socially, caveman groups were tight-knit, perhaps comprising 20 to 40 individuals who shared everything: food, labor, shelter, and child-rearing. Conflict, while possible, had to be managed carefully. Survival demanded cooperation, and individuals depended on the group for safety and knowledge. Leadership may have been informal, resting on experience, hunting prowess, or wisdom, and decisions were likely made communally or by respected elders. Marriage, as we know it, might not have existed in the same sense, but pair bonding, child-rearing, and kinship ties did. Mothers likely nursed their children for years, carried them constantly, and were helped by other women or relatives. Fathers participated in protection and provision, and the whole group shared the responsibility for teaching and raising the young. Language, though not preserved in artifacts, was essential. Gestures, vocalizations, and eventually spoken language allowed humans to cooperate in increasingly complex ways, tracking animals, sharing knowledge, crafting tools, or expressing emotions. Some researchers suggest that storytelling, which binds humans across cultures, may have originated in these ancient fire circles, where myths and lessons were passed on in dramatic, memorable form. Despite the hardships, life was not devoid of joy or curiosity. There were likely moments of laughter, dancing, mimicry, games with stones or bones, early music with flutes made from bird bones, and simple drums made from stretched hides. Observations of the moon's phases, star patterns, and the changing seasons entered their awareness and may have planted the seeds of primitive calendars or rituals tied to celestial events. They were deeply attuned to nature, its cycles, dangers, and gifts, and likely felt a sense of reverence for the great animals they hunted, the forests they wandered, and the elements that sustained or destroyed. Injuries were common: broken bones, infections, bites. But many skeletons show signs of healing, implying that even the injured were cared for. The elderly, though rare, were valued repositories of knowledge and stories, and their survival testified to the group's resilience and compassion. Migration was a constant theme in caveman life. As the Ice Age advanced and retreated, humans followed herds, fleeing encroaching glaciers or seeking warmer valleys, crossing land bridges into new continents, adapting to deserts, tundras, rainforests, and highlands. This spirit of movement, risk, and exploration defined their days. Each new territory brought new tools, foods, animals, and threats, but also new innovations. Over time, they learned to fish with spears, weave simple baskets, create ornaments from shells or teeth, and perhaps even perform rituals under moonlight. Though they lacked metal, writing, or wheels, they laid the foundations for everything that followed: agriculture, cities, science, and belief systems. They were not inferior versions of us, but us in an earlier form, curious, creative, communal, and resilient beyond measure. They lived in a world where every sound, scent, and shadow mattered, where the boundary between life and death was thin, where the group was all that stood between survival and extinction. Yet in that world, they carved images of bison with such grace they still astonish us. They buried their dead with red ochre and beads. They watched the stars and wondered, just as we do. Over thousands of years, as tools became more refined and human groups more numerous, knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from generation to generation, not by books but by repetition, memory, and ritual. Fire starting techniques improved. Spears became atlatls, simple huts became more weather resistant, social groups expanded through intergroup meetings, perhaps for trading, mate exchange, or seasonal gatherings. Communication networks began to stretch across landscapes, rivers, mountains, plains, spreading ideas, stories, songs. The beginnings of identity formed, not just I am hungry or I must hunt, but I belong to this group. I remember my ancestor, I believe in that spirit. And though the day-to-day activities remained tethered to the needs of survival, food, water, shelter, safety, the mental world of these humans was blossoming. They knew fear, love, jealousy, awe. They dreamed, they mourned, they created symbols. Their lives, often painted as brutish and short, were in fact full of meaning, woven from hardship, but also from small triumphs: a successful hunt, a new baby, a story remembered, a fire kindled under rain. Thus, the life of a caveman was not merely about survival in a cruel and primitive world, but about the early, faltering steps toward all that we are. The hands that painted in ochre, carved in bone, or knapped flint were not so different from our own. They worked with what they had. They built the first scaffolding of human society. Their days spent in toil were also filled with the wonder of discovery, the strength of kinship, and the first sparks of what would become civilization. Though they vanished into the millennia, their shadows remain etched in cave walls, buried in red earth, embedded in our DNA. And perhaps if one sat beside their fire, listened to their stories, and watched their eyes reflecting the flicker of flame, one would not see a savage, but a brother, a sister, an ancestor reaching across time. The dawn of another day in the life of early humans unfolded without clocks or alarms, guided only by the golden rays of the sun creeping over ridges and hills, breaking the hush of night and stirring life beneath furs and hides that barely kept the chill of the night away. The faint stirrings of limbs beneath animal skins, the first crackling of rekindled embers, and the soft murmur of breath over coals announced the beginning of routine, a day not different in structure, but never the same in experience. There were no calendars, yet their bodies and memories carried the rhythm of seasons, of planting moons, of hunting times, of rivers swelling or drying, of the migration patterns of game. Hunger was the silent master that governed them from the moment they opened their eyes to the sky, and so they rose from the rocky floors or packed earth, stretched their aching muscles hardened from ceaseless work, and without complaint stepped into a world of alertness, where danger lurked in every sound and sustenance had to be earned again from an unforgiving world. In a small clearing not far from a cave opening blackened with soot, a group prepared for the day's journey. Spears were checked for straightness, their tips reaffixed with sinew bindings soaked and hardened. Crude slings were inspected for wear, and stone blades were tested with strips of dried hide. Among them, a boy not yet of hunting age crouched with wonder, watching his elder brother fasten a blade to a long shaft with hardened resin and crushed charcoal, learning not through words but repetition, for the tongue of the time was sparse but weighted, gestural, and alive with motion and mimicry. Women gathered near the fire pit, their arms full of last night's scraps, bones stripped of meat, but not of marrow, skins to be dried or tanned with brains and urine, wood to be fed into the slowly waking fire. One woman, aged but still sure of hand, crushed roots between stones, humming a tune passed down for so long that it bore no author, only purpose. She paused to blow hair from her face and signaled to a girl no taller than her hip to bring her a bundle of green leaves. These would be used to line the pit where meat would be roasted, a method learned from watching how the earth itself steamed after rain, how heat and water softened even the toughest roots. Two men, lean and strong from years of lean meals and long walks, emerged from behind a thicket where they had checked traps set near a stream. One carried a limp hare, still warm, the other nothing, shaking his head as he approached the fire. It was not a good sign. Every day that passed without meat strained the patience and stomachs of the group. Hunger meant risk, and risk was the realm of the hunters. 3 men and 1 woman, an excellent tracker whose eyes could read the language of hoof, paw, and claw in disturbed soil, gathered for the hunt. They painted their faces with ash and ochre, not for magic but to reduce glare, to hide their scent with earth, to become something less human and more a part of the forest. They moved in silence, their feet used to the terrain, their eyes always in motion, watching for signs. A broken branch, a pile of fresh dung, the heavy scent of musk in the air, these were clues, and when they found the tracks of a deer, fresh and deep in the damp earth, the woman knelt and placed her palm beside it, measuring time with instinct. The chase began. It was not quick. It never was. Hunting was not the dramatic chase imagined by modern minds. It was an act of endurance, strategy, and immense patience. They stalked the animal for hours, following it over ridges, through creeks, beneath the reach of bird-shadowed canopies, moving as ghosts. At times they ran, barefoot and silent. Other times they froze, crouched in thickets, waiting for the animal to tire. Eventually, they would kill by exhaustion, persistence, and timing, not merely brute force. While the hunters were gone, the camp lived. Children chased one another with sticks, laughing in short, high-pitched bursts, but were quickly hushed by mothers, fearful of drawing predators. One old man, whose legs were too bent to walk far, knelt before a large stone and began etching lines with a flint scraper. What he drew was not art for beauty's sake. It was memory, a retelling. He carved the image of a bear they had seen weeks before, looming, jaws open, flanked by small human figures. Perhaps he was retelling the tale of how they had driven it off, or perhaps honoring the creature that had nearly taken a child. Beside him, a youth watched, not entirely understanding, but knowing this was important. These crude engravings were history before history existed, memory set in stone, a language before script. Elsewhere, another woman wove strands of bark into a basket, her fingers moving in repetitive rhythm, singing under her breath, while another beside her rubbed animal fat into a stiff hide, softening it for clothing. Their lives were a circle of need and creativity. Every act was practical, but also shaped by time, tradition, and often unseen purpose. As the sun arched high, heat rippled across the clearing, and birds went quiet in the branches. This was the dangerous hour. Predators hunted in the cool of dawn or the shadows of dusk, but the sun-blind noon brought other risks: dehydration, exposure, missteps on sharp rocks, and fatigue. One child collapsed from the heat, and his mother rushed to shade him, pouring water from a bladder into his mouth, watching him recover slowly. That water had been fetched from a stream a mile away, carried in a hide bladder knotted tightly, and slung over a shoulder. Every task, however small, carried effort. Even laughter cost sweat. As shadows lengthened, the mood shifted. The absence of the hunters hung like a veil. The women stopped their weaving more often to look toward the path. The elders grew quiet. It was the kind of silence born not from peace but from waiting. And then at last, the sound of feet. The four returned, two carrying the legs of a deer, its body already dressed and quartered, its blood drying in streaks down their arms. Relief and joy were not expressed in shouts but in grins, hand clasps, a long exhale. That night, meat would roast again, marrow would be sucked from bone, and bellies for a brief moment would be full. As firelight returned to the cave, illuminating the damp walls streaked with soot and the orange flicker dancing over stone tools and sleeping bundles, the people gathered. Food was distributed fairly, sometimes by custom, sometimes by respect, elders and children first, then hunters. There was no formal ceremony, but an unspoken code governed the sharing. To hoard was to betray the group, and betrayal in such a small, interdependent society could mean exile, which was as good as death. After the eating, the sounds softened. Fat popped in the fire, an old man began to hum a low tone, rhythmic and rising like the wind in trees, and soon others joined. It became a chant, a call not to gods perhaps, but to memory. Then the storytelling began. Not everyone told stories. There were those with the voice, the memory, the presence. One woman, face painted with ochre, lifted her hands and began to tell of a hunt from her youth, her arms tracing the path of the stag, her voice lilting like wind through reeds. The children leaned forward, eyes wide, mouths half full of meat. Even the hunters sat rapt, though they'd heard it before. Story was not repetition, it was renewal. It kept the tribe together through winters, through loss, through time. The fire burned low, and sleep took them one by one. But the night was not safe. One man stayed awake, spear in hand, eyes half closed but ears keen. He would be replaced before dawn by another. Predators prowled the periphery, wolves, bears, even the silent approach of a saber cat now and then. They would not come close to fire unless desperate, but they watched, and the humans knew they were being watched. That knowledge etched caution into every step they took. That vigilance shaped their minds. This constant dance with death did not breed only fear. It sharpened memory, cooperation, foresight. Over countless generations, this pressure would forge the kind of brain that could imagine traps before they were needed, that could look at stars and wonder where they led, that could mourn a lost companion long after their bones were buried. Days passed. Not all days had drama. Some were filled with rain, with the slow, monotonous drip from leaves, with the shivering cold of wet skin, and the sound of children crying from discomfort. Others brought long walks to collect honey from trees, risking stings for the rich, sweet energy that seemed like a gift from the gods. There were days of pain, injuries from sharp stones, burns from fire, bites that festered, and death came not as a stranger, but as a regular visitor. A woman dying in childbirth, her blood soaking into the earth, was not an uncommon sight. The group would mourn quietly, with gestures, perhaps a song. The body might be buried near a tree, marked with a stone, or left in a cave with favorite beads and tools. Even in sorrow, they honored their dead. The belief that the spirit lingered or traveled beyond this life was more than religion. It was a comfort, a narrative that gave meaning to pain. And across generations, the group grew. A child who once mimicked spear throws became the group's best hunter. An old man who once sang by the fire now sat silent, watching new stories unfold. New faces joined as groups met in passing, strangers who spoke similar languages, who bartered with obsidian or shells, who exchanged mates to prevent inbreeding, who brought stories of lands beyond the mountain, or of giant creatures no longer seen. These meetings were dangerous but vital. Sometimes they ended in conflict, other times in feast and music. From such exchanges came new tools, better traps, improved flint techniques. Knowledge flowed like a river, slow but unstoppable. And through it all, the world changed. The glaciers receded, forests moved, the game shifted routes. Cavemen followed. Some crossed land bridges into vast new territories. Others settled along coasts, eating fish and mollusks. Some began to stay longer in one place, returning to the same camps year after year, recognizing which plants returned, which trees bore fruit, and which rivers yielded the most fish. The seeds of agriculture, still thousands of years away, were being planted in minds, not in soil. But for now they lived as they had always lived, with alertness, with pain, with joy, with firelight stories, and with eyes turned always to the horizon. This was the real life of cavemen, not cartoonish brutes, but resilient, clever, social beings whose days were filled with labor and creativity, whose nights echoed with songs and memory, whose hands shaped tools and lives with the same care. They were not merely ancestors, they were us in beginning form, their blood still running in our veins, their dreams flickering in our fires, their footsteps echoing beneath the cities we have built. To understand what they did all day is to understand the raw beauty of survival, the first spark of civilization, the unbroken thread of humanity, stretching backward into the dark and forward into the unknown. As the generations passed, though none among them could name the concept of a generation or count beyond the number of fingers on their hands, life continued in the unbroken rhythm of day and night, hunger and fulfillment, memory and forgetfulness. Children became adults in the span of what seemed to be a handful of seasons, and the elders aged visibly from year to year, their bodies bending, hair growing whiter and thinner, their hands still working, still weaving, still scraping meat from bones, or pointing with crooked fingers toward marks in the earth or stars in the sky. The world around them shifted slowly, imperceptibly, but no less profoundly. Herds that once came predictably began to wander in different patterns. Trees once rich with fruit bore less each year. Snow fell where it hadn't in decades, but they adjusted as they always had, with movement. Migration was not a plan so much as a reaction. When the food disappeared or the river dried up, they followed the path of instinct and memory. A nearby group once split when a feud over hunting rights escalated into violence. One group moved northward, taking with them nothing but their tools, their children and their fire. The group that remained felt their absence in the long nights. Songs sounded thinner, stories lost key characters, and the roles of mothers, brothers and elders had to be reassigned, not by words but by actions. Yet the cycle of life continued. The fire remained lit. Infants were born, mewling against their mother's bare skin. Old men died in their sleep, or not long after an injury, their bodies returning to the earth with ceremony, both simple and profound. Life was fragile, but its will was unstoppable. A boy named Harak, known in the group for his quietness and sharp vision, began noticing patterns others didn't. He saw the way birds circled before a storm, the way a certain mushroom never grew near fire ants, the way dry leaves would curl and pop before a predator appeared in the distance. He was not the strongest of his peers, nor the most outspoken, but his eyes missed little, and the elders began to favor him when it came to tracking. One morning, before the sun rose, Harak stirred from sleep with a dream still fresh in his mind. A stag, painted red, with eyes of fire, stood unmoving on a high cliff, then leapt into air and vanished. He mentioned this to the old woman who carved bones into necklaces and charms, and she placed her hand over his heart and nodded, saying nothing. That night, after the meat was eaten and the marrow shared among the children, she pulled Harak to the fire and told the others of his dream. Dreams in their world were messages. Sometimes they were warnings, sometimes blessings. The old woman, whose name was forgotten by all but the eldest among them, said the dream meant Harak would lead them one day, not by strength of arm, but by strength of seeing. He protested, embarrassed, but her word carried weight, and from then on, Harak found himself watched more closely, trusted more often. He was taken on longer scouting journeys, not just to hunt but to map in his mind the distant terrain, rocks that bled red when struck, rivers that curved like serpents, trees that buzzed with bees whose honey was the color of fire. Meanwhile, changes continued around them that none of them could name but all could feel. A year came when the rains did not fall in spring, the berries shriveled. Deer failed to return. A cold wind came early. They had to travel farther to find food, farther still to find water, and with every step away from their ancestral cave, they carried not just their possessions but their memory. Stories were retold with small changes to suit the new lands. Now the spirit animals were different. Now the signs to read the earth had to be relearned. Some resisted. An elder named Yagan, who had seen more seasons than he had teeth remaining, refused to leave the cave even when the rest prepared to move. He said he was born there and would die there. They left him with meat and water and returned weeks later to find him gone. A smear of ash and bones near the hearth, a necklace of teeth placed beside the stone wall where he had carved the faces of ancestors. They honored his passing in the new place by drawing his image in charcoal, a bent man with fire in his chest, walking among the trees dotting there. In their new location, a stretch of highland forest broken by meadows and streams, they began again. They built shelters of poles and hides, ringed with stones to keep the wind away. Harak led a group that found a cave overlooking a valley thick with wild goats and rabbits. It became their new center, and over time its walls bore the red and black markings of animals they hunted, animals they feared, and things no one could name. Swirls and dots, lines crossing in stars, human shapes with wings or extra limbs. These were not decorations but sacred acts. Painting was done only after silence, after fasting or dreaming, and not everyone was allowed to take part. It was a rite. Children watched in awe as elders dipped fingers into crushed berries and burnt ash, whispering as they traced the walls, sometimes guided by dreams, sometimes by memories of hunts where friends had died, sometimes by things they had seen and could not explain. One bitter winter, when snow covered the valley and all that could be hunted had moved beyond reach, a stranger came. He was old, hunched, with a limp and a face pocked with scars. At first they readied their spears, but he raised empty hands and knelt before the fire, offering nothing but a song. It was a language they only partly recognized, some words familiar, others foreign. The old woman who read dreams approached him, touched his forehead, and whispered something. He was allowed to stay. Over weeks he shared stories of lands beyond the mountains, of fire that never died, of people who made fish swim toward them with stones shaped like stars. He showed them how to carve hooks from antler, how to trap birds with loops of sinew and shiny bait. Then one morning he was gone, leaving behind only a bone flute and a bundle of dried herbs tied with string made from bark. Harak kept the flute and tried to copy the stranger's songs, the hollow music drifting across the valley like wind through grass. Years passed. Harak became an elder. His hair grew long and streaked with silver. Children now sat at his feet. He watched as others led the hunts, as new fires were kindled by those who once suckled beside him. The old woman died in her sleep and was buried in a high place, wrapped in white hide. Her charms hung on the branches above her grave. Her death was mourned with silence, with fire kept burning all night, with a story told of the first woman who could speak to trees. As Harak sat beside the fire one night, carving a bone to resemble the red-eyed stag of his dream so many years before. He thought not of himself but of what would come next. Already he saw the signs. Some children began stacking stones for play, shaping them into walls. Some young men preferred to stay in one place, to fish and gather rather than hunt. Women experimented with planting seeds near the cave, noticing that some returned in the same place if the soil was turned. These were small acts barely noted, but they would change the world. The idea of returning to the same place year after year, of building upon what was left before, was taking root. No one named it, but the great shift had begun. Harik died, not in a hunt or storm, but quietly beneath a tree overlooking the valley he had once explored as a boy. His last breath came with a smile, and those who found him wrapped his body with care, burned a small fire beside him for 3 days, and placed his flute near his feet. The story of Harik would be told for many generations, not because he was the strongest or most feared, but because he saw what others did not, because he listened to dreams, and because he taught that stories and seeing were as important as hunting and fire. The people stayed in that valley for many years. New children were born, carrying the names of old ones. The cave became sacred, its walls filled with new images of fish, of plants, of humans holding hands. The seasons still dictated their lives, but now they returned to the same shelters, knowing the earth would provide again. And so unknowingly, they stepped toward what the future would call civilization. But the spirit of the old ways never vanished. They still hunted when the land called for it. They still sang by firelight. They still honored the dead. And deep in the cave, near the oldest drawings, a child once found the bone carving of a stag with eyes of fire left on a stone shelf, coated in dust but untouched by time. She took it in her hand, and though she didn't know the name Harik, she felt something stir, an old story, still alive, still whispering from the deep places of the world, reminding them of who they had been, of the long walk behind them, and the even longer one ahead. The girl who found the bone stag was no more than 7 winters old, with matted black hair and a face that still held the softness of early childhood. But in her hands she now held something ancient, something no one had told her existed, something that seemed to hum with the weight of memory. She ran with it through the cave's entrance, past her sleeping mother and the fire where 2 men sharpened flint, past the racks of drying meat and hides, and held it aloft before the old man who had taken over the telling of stories since Harik's death. He was called Ral, bent like a tree under years of weight, with skin like bark and eyes that never seemed to fully close, and when he saw the carving in her hands, he did not speak for a long time. He reached out and took it with trembling fingers, turned it slowly in the firelight, nodded once, and said only that she had been chosen to carry it now. She didn't understand what that meant, not fully, but that night she sat closest to the fire, and when the stories were told, her voice joined at the end, a small quiet echo repeating the last lines of the tale like a promise. Her name was Mirror, and from that night on she wore the bone stag around her neck, strung on a cord of woven grass and sinew, and though many would forget why she did so, none would ask her to remove it. Seasons passed. The world turned in its silent, relentless rhythm, and the valley changed as it always had, but now there were signs of permanence. Stones were stacked at the cave mouth to create windbreaks, and others were placed to mark graves. Bark was stripped not only to weave baskets, but also to line pits where food could be stored. They dug deeper now, not just for roots but for shaping holes to hold water or hide goods. Some young men began to carve paths with repeated steps, their feet marking trails so often that grass no longer grew there. Children were born who never knew another camp, who thought the cave had always belonged to their people. But nature, never still, gave no guarantees. One summer came hotter than any remembered, and the river that once fed the valley shrank into a string of muddy puddles. Fish died, and the air reeked of rot. They tried to dig deeper wells, but the water tasted of salt and stone. Plants withered, game vanished, the children cried from thirst, and so again they moved. Not all, but most. Mira, now a woman with strong arms and quiet eyes, was among those who led the way. They walked east for many days, over hills burned golden by the sun, through forests where the trees groaned and dropped leaves in desperation. They drank dew in the mornings and chewed bitter roots at night. One boy died of fever along the way, and his mother carried his body for 2 days before she let him go, burying him beneath a rock shaped like a crouching bear. Then, at last, they reached a place where the land breathed again, where a river coiled like a sleeping serpent, where the trees grew tall and the air smelled of life. There they settled, and for many years they stayed, building shelters of clay and bark near the river's edge, using the fire to harden tools, boiling water in stone-lined pits by dropping in heated rocks, and catching fish with baskets and traps, taught by the memory of the old wanderer Harak had once known. It was Mira who remembered his songs and taught them again, humming their broken syllables as she worked. The people called their new home Talon, which meant where the river bends, and Mira carved the bone stag into the wall of her shelter, beside images of goats, hands and circles that may have meant time, or sun, or just thought. In Talon, the people began to mark time not only by seasons, but by patterns they began to see in the sky. One man named Yor, quiet and strange, began to draw not animals but dots and lines, keeping track of where the moon rose and where certain stars appeared during different moons. He carved these marks into long sticks of driftwood, wrapped them in vines, and tucked them in crevices. People laughed at him at first, but when he predicted the coming of a great storm by the shape of the moon, they stopped laughing. Mira invited him to speak during the fire stories, and soon others began watching the sky, tracing stars with fingers, naming them the hunter, the mother, the twin rivers, the cold horn. And with the sky came time, and with time came the slow awakening of questions. Why did the rains fall sometimes but not others? Why did some plants grow better when buried in the dark earth than left alone? Why did fire leap so quickly when certain woods were used? Or why did meat taste sweeter when cooked over coals than over flame? These questions led not to answers but to acts. They began to plant seeds more deliberately, selecting the larger grains and pushing them into soft earth beside their shelters. They carved channels to bring water from the river. They returned to the same fields and found, to their wonder, that the seeds grew again, stronger. The older ones remained cautious, reminding them of past famine, of times when rivers vanished or animals fled, but the younger ones embraced this new way. The people of Talon began to harvest in groups, began to stay not just for years but for generations. Houses of woven walls were repaired, made stronger with packed mud. Ceremonies began, first to mark the start of planting, then the harvest, then the birth of a child, or the death of a hunter. The fire still burned each night, but now it did not move. It was no longer a traveller's fire, it was a hearth, a center dot. As their world expanded, so did their ideas of who they were. They began to trade with neighboring groups, bartering salt for beads, stone blades for dried meat. They learned to shape clay into pots and to fire them with care so they held water without breaking. They painted them with symbols, spirals, zigzags, handprints, and no one knew exactly what the symbols meant, but everyone knew they mattered. These painted vessels became prized. One woman, Tira, shaped pots with such grace that neighboring people walked days to see them. She spoke little but let her hands speak. Her pots held not just food or water but memory, and it was said she could shape a story into a curved dot. Mira grew old, her hair whitened, her back bent. She no longer hunted or carried water, but she was carried herself on litters when she needed to move, or by arms when she grew too weak to stand. But she still sat near the fire, still wore the bone stag, now cracked and yellowed, its details smoothed by time and touch. When she died, the people wept for many days. They placed her body on a pyre of sweet-smelling wood, surrounded her with beads and clay pots, and lit the fire with the old chant. The smoke rose into the sky, curling like the river, carrying her story. The bone stag was not burned. It was placed in a clay jar and buried beneath her sleeping place. And though years would pass and new people would come, her name would echo in the stories told on quiet nights. Mira, who followed the dream, who led the people, who carried the stag. Generations passed. The people of Talon built more permanent homes. They dug deeper wells. They penned animals and began to domesticate them. Goats, dogs, small pigs, they tamed them, bred them, lived beside them. Children grew up feeding animals instead of chasing them. The hunt remained but became ritual, a coming of age more than a necessity. They began to count days, using small stones or marks on walls. They remembered not just stories but dates. Festivals emerged, elders became priests, songs became chants, arbiter became priests. The cave where Mira had once found the stag was visited less and less, until one day it was forgotten entirely, swallowed by time and vines. Somewhere, buried beneath a hearth in a forgotten home, lay the bone carving, and if one listened closely on certain nights, when the fire cracked just right, one might imagine the echo of a girl's feet running through a cave, the hush of the ancient world still alive, the voice of memory whispering not in words but in feeling. That hunger was once sacred, that fire was once a miracle, that survival was not merely toil but the beginning of everything. And so, the story of the cavemen did not end, but transformed. The line from spear to plough, from cave to village, from silence to language, drawn by hands no less human than ours, by lives lived one breath at a time. But even buried beneath soil and centuries, the spirit of those early lives was not extinguished, merely dormant, and the thread that bound the first painted handprints to the wall of a cave remained unbroken, even as the people who made them were long turned to dust. For though names were forgotten, the shapes of tools left behind, the bone flutes cracked, and the shelters collapsed into the earth, something endured, an instinct, a rhythm, an inherited flame passed from hand to hand across time's vast canyon. In the lands beyond Talon, over riverbanks and high ridges, other bands emerged, descendants of the same ancient people, shaped by different forests, different stars, but sharing the same urgent need to endure, to belong, and to understand. And like the people of Talon, they too began to change. No single moment defined it, no thunderclap or divine voice, but rather a slow unfolding. The first time a child planted a seed and saw it grow, the first time a hunter paused before a kill and saw in the animal's eye a reflection of himself, the first time a mother looked at her newborn and wondered not just if it would live, but what it would become. These questions stirred in the minds of men and women whose lives were still shaped by need, yet whose thoughts were beginning to shape the world in return. In one such place, far from Talon, where mountains cut the horizon and the earth cracked with heat during summer's height, a group of humans had learned to dig channels from seasonal streams into trenches that watered their crops. They had no word for irrigation, no concept of agriculture as something separate from their lives. It was simply what they did and what they taught their children. The dry ground, once home only to thornbush and fleeting prey, now yielded barley and a bitter grass that once ground and mixed with water formed a porridge that filled stomachs longer than roasted meat. They still hunted, but it was no longer their lifeblood. It was now reserved for ritual, for times of celebration, for rites of passage. A boy was not a man until he had taken down a wild boar with his own spear, just as a girl was not considered ready to keep her own hearth until she had ground enough grain to feed 10 people in one night. And though such customs varied across the scattered peoples of the earth, the essence was the same. Survival had become identity, and identity demanded memory. They built markers to remember where seeds grew best, to trace the rise of floods, to track when birds returned in spring. These markers became totems, and totems became symbols, and symbols became language, not yet spoken in fixed words as we know them, but scratched in clay, pressed into bark, remembered in songs that each generation altered slightly, but never abandoned. From among one such tribe arose a woman named Sira, whose gift was not strength or cunning, but memory so perfect she could recall not only who had caught the largest fish during the last flood season, but also the names of all the children born in the 12 years since she herself had been a child. Her voice was deep and melodic, and when she sang, people stopped what they were doing to listen, not out of obedience, but because in her songs lived their past, their laws, their truths. She carried a pouch made of antelope skin, inside of which she kept carved tokens, small clay discs and knotted cords that served as cues for her stories. If one had asked her, she could have recited the lineage of every family within her tribe, could have sung the pattern of the stars during the season of the northern winds, could have named every animal painted on the stones where the first shelters were built. Her gift was considered sacred, and when children were born, their names were given only after Sira had sung their first night's cry into the memory of the tribe. When she died at the age of nearly 50 winters, a great age in a world still so fragile, her pouch was placed in the center of the village and covered with a mound of earth and stones. Around it, people placed their own carvings, their own marks, and over time this grew into a place of pilgrimage. Not a grave, but a library of memory, unwritten, unspeaking, but weighty with meaning. But as people settled, as they built more permanent homes, as clay pots and sharpened stones became more refined, so too did the problems they faced grow more complex. Disputes over land, once vast and empty, became disputes over fields, wells, and animals. One man's fence became another's boundary. A child from one group injured a child from another, and where once such things were settled with separation or silence, now they required judgment, compromise, mediation. This gave rise to a new kind of leader, not just the strong hunter or the wise elder, but the one who could speak for many, who could persuade, remember promises, and shape conflict into peace. Some leaders became revered for their fairness, others feared for their ambition, and thus society began to take form, no longer only the loose circle around a fire, but a lattice of roles and rules, sometimes invisible, sometimes carved into wood or stone. The world was no longer only wild, it was being tamed, and in that taming, humanity began to forget what it once was. The stories still spoke of ancestors who walked with animals, who heard the voices of trees and stars, but fewer and fewer believed them. As generations passed, those stories turned to myths, and the people who had once lived them became figures of legend. Yet in the mountains, in the forests untouched by fields and furrows, there still lived small groups who remembered the old ways, not because they resisted change, but because their lands offered no need for it. These groups, more nomadic, more attuned to the movement of animals and seasons, retained the rhythms of their ancestors. They painted on cave walls with new pigments, adding new animals to old hunts. They passed on fire-making techniques that had been perfected through millennia. They watched the sky, not for calendars but for signs. One such group, high in a glacial valley, where snow fell half the year and silence reigned longer than song, preserved a tradition older than any village, that of the fire watch. Each night, a young person chosen by age and readiness would tend the communal fire alone, keeping it alive until sunrise. It was not just a practical task, but a spiritual one, for it was believed that the fire was the breath of the first ancestor, the first human who had dared to steal flame from the mountain itself. While the fire burned, the people were connected to that beginning, and so the chosen ones did not sleep. They sat beside the flames, eyes open, ears tuned to the sounds of wind and wolf and owl, hands never far from wood and ember. Some claimed that during their watch, they saw visions, faces in the smoke, ancestors dancing in the flicker, shapes moving at the edge of darkness. No one mocked these stories, for in them lived the old awe, the sense that humans were not masters of the world, but guests in it. Over centuries, these two worlds, the settled and the wandering, drifted apart. The former built temples and walls, carved roads into stone, wrote stories on tablets and skins, forgetting that stories had once been sung but could be written. The latter remained in the margins, following herds, climbing mountains, crossing deserts, always moving, always listening. And yet, when the great cities fell, when floods and fires consumed their temples and time wore down their roads, it was the wanderers who remained, unchanged, untouched, carrying still in their bones the memories of the first humans. They did not need maps because they followed the stars. They did not need books because their stories lived in breath. And when they met others, survivors, refugees, curious travelers, they shared not knowledge, but experience. They taught how to make fire with damp wood, how to find water in dry places, how to carve a bone into a tool or a memory. And thus, the cycle continued, not a line but a spiral, a return to something forgotten, made new again. In the deepest recesses of one ancient cave, long sealed by rock slide and unknown to the modern world, lay the untouched markings of those first storytellers, paintings of animals long extinct, of humans with outstretched arms and fire above their heads. In a hollow beneath one of the walls, wrapped in a rotting skin bag, lay a carving of a stag, its eyes hollowed with time, but its shape unmistakable. It waited there in silence, buried in Earth's memory, for a day when the stories would be heard again, when someone would see not a relic but a voice, and remember what it meant to live by firelight, to listen to the wind, to tell a story not to entertain, but to survive. The story of what cavemen did all day was not only about stone and meat and ash, it was about the beginning of being human, of thought taking form, of hearts beating not just for the next meal, but for each other, for the future, for meaning. And though we walk in cities now, surrounded by steel and screen, beneath it all, we are still shaped by their fire, still guided by their instincts, still telling their story every time we remember. And in time the world changed again, not in ways sudden or violent, but in those slow creeping movements that shape millennia unnoticed, like water carving valleys or wind wearing stone smooth. Forests retreated as plains expanded, rivers shifted their courses, and the animals that once thundered across the land in massive herds, bison, aurochs, mammoth, began to vanish one by one, their bones buried beneath layers of silt and forgotten sky. The people now spread across vast lands and divided by distance, language and experience, adapted in their own ways. Some remembered the spirits of their ancestors as stars that guided migrations, while others etched their legends into stone pillars or carved them into wooden masks worn during ceremonies in villages that grew with every passing generation. The world grew louder, not with noise, but with meaning. Each tree was not just wood, but shelter, tool, and ancestor. Each river was not merely water, but a line of memory, flowing backward and forward in time. Each fire was not only warmth, but a direct inheritance from the first flickering flame, sparked by trembling hands beneath a night sky, no longer unfamiliar, but known. In a region where rolling grasslands met a low range of hills, a new kind of village emerged, not temporary, like the seasonal camps of old, but fixed, surrounded by palisades and watchposts. Here the people no longer remembered the exact shape of their ancestors' lives, but pieces survived in rituals. Children were still given names beside fire. The stars were still read before planting began. Spears were still passed from father to son, not always used for war, but kept sharp with the reverence of memory. Among them lived an old woman named Ikari, whose hair was thin as riverweed, and whose back bent as if carrying the weight of many winters. She held no title, but everyone came to her when a child was born, or when a sickness spread, or when dreams left people trembling. Her hut, set slightly apart from the others, was filled with bones, not of animals to be eaten, but of creatures long gone, a bird with no living match, a fish with spines like tree branches, the curved tusk of some distant beast. Each was marked with ochre or coal, and each had a story, which she told slowly, as if drawing it up from the ground beneath her. She remembered stories not because she chose to, but because they lived in her, passed down not just from her mother, but from the women before her, in an unbroken chain that stretched back to days when people had no names for themselves beyond the wind and the fire. Ikari told of the Sky Cave, a place spoken of in only the oldest voice, where the first people had left messages in colors that did not fade. No one in the village believed the place existed, not truly, but the tale was told every winter when the winds blew low and the food was tight. Children would gather, wrapped in furs, their breath rising like smoke, and Ikari would sing the song of the cave with stars inside, and of the girl who once found a carved stag with eyes that held the sun. She never gave the girl a name, but everyone knew it was Mirror, though the name was lost long ago, and deep in the roots of that song, in the place beneath understanding, a feeling remained that they were not the beginning, nor the end, but only one link in the great unspooling of time. Years passed. Ikari died during the season of frost. The villagers buried her upright, facing the east, so she could watch the sunrise, and beside her they placed one of her bones, the curved tusk, which she claimed had belonged to a creature tall as trees with skin like stone. Children wept, and the new generation of women took over the singing of stories, though none had Ikari's voice, and some parts were forgotten or changed. In one version, the girl with the stag had wings. In another, the cave was under the sea. But the shape of the truth remained, as if the bones of the story could not rot. And then, far across the earth, other people, strangers with skin like clay, hair like river shadows, eyes like dark lakes, discovered similar caves. They too found red and black animals painted on walls, handprints high where no one could reach without ladders, dots and spirals carved into stone. And though they could not read these images as one might read a word, they felt the same awe that someone long ago had stood in that place, breathed that same dust, seen the same flicker of torchlight, and reached up not just to survive, but to speak. The scholars who studied these places gave names to things: Paleolithic, Neanderthal, Upper Aurignacian, but names were only masks for mystery. What mattered was not the terms but the hum that passed through those caves, the silent drumbeat of memory that echoed through time. And in the lowland villages and high mountain camps, in coastal huts and river towns, echoes of the old world still lingered. A boy would shape a stone into a point and feel, without knowing why, that he had done this before. A girl would mark a line in the dirt and understand it was more than play. It was symbol, path, intention. Some would dream of animals no longer alive and wake certain they had known them. Others would feel drawn to fire in a way they could not explain, watching it as if remembering something buried, something the mind had forgotten, but the spirit still carried like a scar. Even as bronze gave way to iron, and empires rose on the backs of rivers, as writing hardened into tablets and cities reached toward the clouds with stone towers, beneath it all still lay the bones of the old world. Every pillar was once a stick in the ground. Every army was once a circle of spearmen defending a cave. Every poem was once a song beside a fire, sung not for fame but for remembrance. And though the trappings of civilization grew more elaborate, temples, laws, politics, the need remained the same: to belong, to survive, to mean something more than the flesh. And still farther forward, in the world of wheels and wires, of screens and signals, even now the ghost of that ancient world endures. When someone looks up at the stars and feels small, they are feeling what Harak felt. When a child runs their fingers through the grooves on a tree and thinks it speaks, they are remembering Akari's stories. When we light candles for the dead, when we draw symbols on walls, when we tell tales to children that begin a long time ago, we are doing exactly what those first humans did, not mimicking them, but continuing them. We are them, changed only in clothing and name. Beneath our technologies, our languages, our borders, lies that same old fire, waiting. One day, in a dry cave mouth long forgotten, in a land now arid, a group of children will crawl into the shadows to escape the sun. They will laugh and draw shapes in the dust, and one of them will notice something in the wall, something carved, not by weather but by hand. A creature with curved horns and hollow eyes, worn smooth by time but still recognizable. They will not know who made it, or why, but they will go quiet, as if listening to something not heard by ears. One will touch it gently, and for a moment the silence will stretch long, as if time itself were holding its breath. And maybe, without knowing why, one of them will hum a melody that feels like it's always been there. Because what cavemen did all day was not just survive. They made fire, they made tools, they cared for children and buried their dead. They watched the stars, they painted and dreamed, they told stories, and those stories never ended. They became us. And as the children sat there in that sun-bleached cave, squinting through the dust and warm silence, they became more than what they were in that fleeting moment. They became links, unwitting and unchosen, in a chain that had stretched unbroken for tens of thousands of years. Though their world was one of metal and concrete and noise and speed, though they had names for elements their ancestors never saw, and tools that could split atoms or pierce the void of space, their wonder, their instinct to touch and feel and imagine was precisely the same as that of the girl who once held the carved bone stag in her palm. This moment, like so many before it and so many after, was not about discovery in the scientific sense, but in the human one, the slow dawning realization that the past is not buried but sleeping, waiting to be seen again by eyes that still carry the shadows of firelight in their depths. The child who reached out and touched the ancient carving would not know the name Mira, nor the word Paleolithic, but something in her breath would catch, and she would whisper something soft to the others, something made of awe and reverence, and though the words would be her own, the feeling behind them would be older than any language spoken today. For those who came before us, the cave dwellers, the foragers, the nomads who walked barefoot across ice and grass and volcanic plains, they were not primitives as the later ages arrogantly assumed, but a people so deeply attuned to the world that they could read the clouds like maps and taste the soil to know the season. They did not write books, but they remembered through breath, and the living body was the archive. They did not build cities, but their camps were built on knowledge passed through uncounted lifetimes. They had no science, no philosophy, no formal religion, and yet they observed, questioned and worshipped in a way as profound as any cathedral hymn or laboratory theorem. They lived in a constant dialogue with nature, not as masters of it, but as children raised at her breast, wary of her storms, grateful for her gifts, and haunted by her silences. When they painted on cave walls, they were not merely depicting the hunt, they were conjuring it, honoring it, preparing for it spiritually and emotionally. The act of painting itself was ceremony. They crouched in dark chambers, lit only by flickering flame, mixing charcoal and ochre and blood, whispering names that would never be written, only remembered by the rhythm of heartbeat and drum. They sang, they mourned, they feared, they loved, they endured. One winter many ages ago, in a forest long swallowed by desert, a group huddled in a lean-to of mammoth ribs and bark, listening to the howl of the wind tear across the white earth. A baby cried, and its mother, skin cracked from cold, pressed it to her chest and whispered a song her mother had sung to her. The old man beside them, half blind and leaning on a bone cane, hummed along in a broken raps, and as he did, he traced a line in the snow with his finger, the shape of the Great Bear constellation that watched over their journey. They did not know that stars were suns, nor did they need to. They knew the bear returned each spring, and with it, the herds. Knowledge in that world was not separate from belief, it was sacred, and though their words and tools would not survive the cold and rain and erosion, their gaze did. We carry it still, in the way we look to the sky for direction, for comfort, for meaning. Every child who has ever asked, "Why are we here?" has unknowingly echoed the thoughts of 1,000 ancestors crouched in darkness, listening for answers in the crackle of fire and the distant cry of wolves. When modern historians, linguists and archaeologists examine the remains of that time, the handprints, the chipped stones, the bones buried beside ornaments, they can piece together a pattern, a structure, an impression of daily life. They tell us that men hunted and women gathered, that fire was crucial, that tools evolved, that art appeared, but what they cannot measure, and what truly mattered, was what went on in the minds of those who lived then. The father watching his son carve his first spear point, the girl burying her dead sibling with feathers and beads, the elder who dreamed of a serpent that spoke in human tongues, the moments of silence when a tribe stood together watching the sunrise, knowing that they would face hunger or plenty, death or survival, as one. These were the roots of all that we now claim as culture, not the result of accident, but of intent and care. Their lives may have been hard, but they were not empty. There was purpose in their movement, poetry in their labor, prayer in their fear. They were not less than us. In many ways, they were more present, more in tune, more necessary to the earth. In one river valley, sometime after the people of Talon had vanished and their stories become mere symbols etched into the pottery shards scattered across the ancient floodplains, a boy named Kiro wandered into a cave while chasing a wounded fox. His spear was clumsy, the head poorly tied with sinew, and he had yet to earn the respect of the older hunters. The fox eluded him, darting into a narrow crevice that widened suddenly into a cold, still chamber where the sound of his own breath echoed back at him in whispers. There, beneath a ridge of black stone, he found paintings, not new but impossibly old, almost faded into the rock itself. Horses, stags, handprints, and in the center, barely visible, was the outline of a spiral drawn in ash. Kiro stood for a long time, forgetting the fox, forgetting the hunt. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he felt it all the same, that he was not the first to stand there, not the first to fail, not the first to seek. He pressed his own palm beside one of the prints, and heart pounding, swore to return. Years later, as a man, he brought his own children to the cave. He told them not what the paintings were, but what they meant, that others had lived and watched and wondered, just as they now did. And long after Kiro's body returned to the earth, one of those children returned and painted anew, adding a new line to the old spiral, ensuring the story would not end. Thousands of years later, a team of paleontologists would discover that cave, its entrance choked by earth and bramble, and marvel at the overlapping hands, the shift in pigments, the evidence of habitation stretching across millennia. They would photograph and measure and write papers, and they would name the layers by epoch and tool type. But what they would not see, could not see, was the boy chasing a fox, the breathless awe of discovery, the reverent silence. That was not lost, only buried in the invisible current of human memory, which flows not through facts but through story, feeling, and the unconscious inheritance of wonder. And so it continued, into the rising dawn of written history and past it still. We now build satellites and contemplate digital immortality, yet we are haunted by the same questions that pressed against the minds of those first wanderers. Who are we? Why do we dream? Where do we go when we die? What is the shape of time, and can we touch the past, or does it only live inside us? Every time we tell a story, sing a lullaby, stare into a fire, or press our hand to a wall, we are answering those questions in the oldest language we know, not words, but presence. We are remembering a world where every action mattered because survival demanded intention, where every death was a lesson, and every birth a miracle. What cavemen did all day was not primitive, it was profound. They lived with meaning woven into every moment. They watched, they waited, they fought, they feared, but above all they felt, and what they left behind is not just evidence of survival, but a testament to feeling, that to be human is to feel deeply, to strive, to wonder, to grieve, and to try, again and again to leave something behind that whispers, I was here, I lived, I loved, I mattered. And in the end, it is that whisper, growing louder through generations of story and memory and instinct, that still walks beside us today, just as it did beside the first child who ever reached out in the dark and touched the warmth of fire.